Dr. John Morton is a self-described, conventionally trained wildlife biologist, having received his bachelor's, master's, and doctorate in the subject. He spent 40 years in the field and retired last December from the Fish and Wildlife Service. When he started his career, climate change wasn't a subject that was even discussed as an issue. Over the years, he worked in the barrier islands around Maryland, the Chesapeake Bay area, the Mariana Islands, and multiple areas in Alaska, including the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge. During the beginning of his career, he witnessed rising sea levels, unusual storms, and changes in species populations, among other peculiar happenings. Dr. Morton eventually focused on climate change within his career, not because someone convinced him, but because he had seen the evidence firsthand.
What are some of the challenges you've faced in your climate leadership work, and how did you overcome them?
In 2007, I used it as a marker. That's when the American public started to pay attention to climate change. You know, there were still lots of deniers, lots of disbelievers, but they started to think about it, right? Up to then, a lot of the federal agencies had been kind of muzzled a little bit. We weren't allowed to talk about it. But after 2007, started really talking about it. But even after that, one of the problems that I've experienced with climate change, and I still experience it today, is that even as more and more people, and I'm talking agency people as well as the general public, one of the big deals is just because you think climate change is real, you may not think it's a big deal. That's huge. So I think what's hidden in that statistic that 3/4 of Americans believe that climate change is real, lots of them don't believe how bad it is.
Okay, so my next question is, what leadership skills do you find most useful and or necessary in your work?
I think it was in 2009. I got into the agency's, it's called ALDP. It's Advanced Development Leadership Program, okay? And of course, you're taught all these different leadership models and and the one that you hear often but you don't actually see is you can lead from below. You don't have to lead from on top. Just because you have a position on top, first of all, does not make you a leader, right? A leader is more than just the position itself. And so about halfway through my year in that program, I went, well, I don't know that I necessarily want to move up because I have all this great stuff back at Kenai and I'm doing cutting edge stuff. And so about halfway through that year, I decided, well, I'm not going to budge. Well, the kind of research that we've done ever since then has really been driving hard, not just at documenting climate changes themselves, but the piece that I've been working on in the latter part of my career, and now even after I've retired, I continue to hammer at it, is how do we adapt to it, right?
Okay, my next question is, what are some effective ways to engage people in climate change discussions and or action?
Right. So I presented a lot to different public groups, and I was actually told that one of the reasons why I was kind of effective at presenting is I didn't sit around and talk about the human cause aspects of climate change. I was just presenting data on all the things that were changing, right? In relation to how they had been changing. So, the tree line rise and the glaciers receding and wetlands drying and all of this kind of stuff, where we have solid data that this is happening. So I think for a lot of people who had been kind of resistant to the idea that humans were causing climate change, that wasn't even part of my discussion. I don't even care. I just like whatever, right? And here's all these documented changes. Interpret them however you wish, but it's happening. It's not. So I think that was one really big piece.
Kind of along with that, a lot of people talk about the mental and emotional strain and just exhaustion that people are feeling as we talk about how big of a crisis climate change is. Is there some way that you manage that stress, or how do you feel about that?
It's depressing. Really depressing, right? I mean, the bottom line is I went through this period where I recognized that nature is dead. Okay? And that's how we've defined nature, right? Nature is, for most, conventionally, the way lots of people thought about nature, and in fact, if you look at the Wilderness Act, that's how the Wilderness Act was written, is that humans are outside of nature, right? There's nature and then there's humans, right? And every time humans get involved in nature, that's a bad thing. But then one day you suddenly realize that there's a couple things going on here, right? If we are the causing agent, we are also the responsible agent for fixing it. And what we really need to do to get out of this hole is redefine what nature is. Nature, either nature is dead if we accept the original definition, or alternatively, we redefine nature with us being part of nature. And that's the idea of the Anthropocene, right? As soon as you really embrace that thinking, then you suddenly realize, well, I got to take responsibility for this, and I got to help steer the ship.
Okay, I just have a couple more questions for you. And so this one is, who and what inspires you?
The thing that has driven me for much of the latter part of my career here is really this fear that we're in the sixth extinction and that we need to do something. I've actually poked at the Bible, not for religious reasons, but because I was really interested to see what they had to say about Noah's Ark. If Earth is Noah's Ark, and we have to populate it, right? This is our job. This is my job as somebody who's involved in climate adaptation. How do I make those choices? Because we can't save everything, right? And that's called the Noah's Ark dilemma, is what do you stick on there? So just for kicks, I've read the really high-end, scientific literature on this where they do some really high-ended mathematical modeling. But I also wanted to see what they came up with Noah. And it's actually fascinating. I mean, the Bible was right on, man. It doesn't make me religious at all, but I look at books like that these are carrying lessons that we've accumulated over thousands of years. So why should we waste it?
And so my final question is, what is the most important piece of advice you can offer to students who are wishing to engage in climate action work?
A word that I think people need to start thinking about a little bit more is epistemology, how you know what you know. We're not taught to sit down and really evaluate in a logical way where we're getting our information and what we believe to be truth, right? We need to really wrap our head around where we get our information. And this is important, and it also includes experience. I mean, I approach climate differently now than if I were a young person coming up now, where I don't have that 40 years of knowledge, right? The other thing is that I often tell, I wish people would think outside the box. But again, if you want to think outside the box, you have to figure out what the box is first. So if you're a young person and you don't like the way the world is running, you need to figure out why it's running that way before you can change it. So I would say that's my message to a lot of young people is stop whining and figure out why it works the way it does. And sometimes there's good reasons for it, and sometimes there's reasons that are no longer relevant. And that's very often the case, is that it's running. It's kind of like inertia, right? It's running because that's the way it's always been. Doesn't make it right. It's just the way it's been run. And so what you have to do is you have to figure out how you can change that.
Like Dr. Morton, my climate change experience includes 3 years of working in the wildlife refuge system at the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge and witnessing the changes within my home state of Alaska. In the future, I hope to continue to protect the beautiful nature around us from the changing climate by creating convenient and universal sustainability practices and education to ensure that everyone knows their part in protecting our planet.